Let's see. Okay, so we've got attendees filing in. Great. Wow. Okay. Well, Zoom is doing well. That's nice to see.
I saw a note last night that the stock value of Zoom is now 50% higher than all US airlines combined.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Amazing.
That
The
is
point
wild.
is, the point is Zoom gets you there, the airlines can't get you there. So yeah, but boy, that is a stark statistic. That is a bit depressing, frankly, in my mind. But I'm happy for Zoom, but I'm depressed for the other folks.
Yeah, it's looking tough, but at the same time, we've got opportunities like some of the food and beverage companies that we deal
Yeah.
with. They're doing really well.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting rearrangement of the map, so to speak. And speaking of maps, I guess let's turn back to the world and get this show on the road. What do we say? So everybody who is just logging in, thank you for joining us. This is our very first session on the COVID Response Network. I'm Julian Leuthold. I'm the founder and CEO of Get Global. And when the coronavirus issue became a big one, and it was obvious that this was not going to be localized to China and would have a huge global impact, immediately the responsibility to inform our audience kicked in, and you know, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. Hopefully we can prove it to you again and again, but my sense is that our expert network is uniquely capable of handling this moment and able to help the companies around the world that are dealing with the effects from the coronavirus, whether those are on workforce or on marketing or sales, every aspect. There's someone in our network now or tomorrow who's going to be able to help. So that's our responsibility to you. And with that, I'll introduce two very distinguished guest speakers who both participated in Get Global before and enthusiastically agreed to do this today to share their insights with you. I'll start with Frank Lavin. He's the CEO of Export Now, which is an e-commerce platform focused on helping American companies, or really companies anywhere, enter the China market and succeed. So I'll let him describe a little bit more about what the company does, but he comes to us not only as an executive now, but with executive background at Bank of America, Edelman, Citibank, and several others, but also with a government background as the US Ambassador to Singapore, the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, a longtime White House aide and operator around Washington. He's got a wealth of experience, and we're just very proud to have him as an ongoing friend of Get Global and participant today. We have also Craig Allen, who is the president of the US China Business Council, which is the premier business council, binational business council focused on trade and business issues between the US and China. He has the world's largest companies on his board. Let me turn off Slack. And he receives the best insight because of that. He stays very close to his member companies. And before being at the US-China Business Council, he was the ambassador to Brunei during the time of the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And he was also with the US Department of Commerce with postings all around Asia and I think a couple in Europe. Is that right, Craig?
Africa.
And Africa. So he's been helping companies figure out what to do in Asia and around the world for a very long time, just like Frank has. And between these two, they're really on the front lines of everything that's going on today in Asia more broadly, but also specifically with China. So thank you both. Thank you, Craig, for joining us. Thank you, Frank. So to get started, I figured I would pass it off to Frank Lavin to give some remarks about what he's been seeing. He's been very close to it because you're in Hong Kong right now, or Singapore?
I'm in Singapore right now, calling you about 6 a.m. Singapore time.
Thanks for making time. Thank you.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Frank.
Thanks, Julian, for the very kind introduction. I'm delighted to get back with the Get Global community again, and I'm super delighted to be on with my old comrade in arms, Craig Allen, who's really one of the top China guys around. So hopefully we'll have just a great conversation. I say this morning because I'm on China time. I'm in Singapore. You can get to China. The trouble is, if I go to China, I have to be in quarantine for 14 days. And then if I come back to Singapore, it's 14 more days. So I'm sort of holding the fort in Singapore till the dust settles a bit. We can travel more freely. But you just explained it, Julian. My business is actually in Shanghai. Just a word of background. What we do at this company at Export Now is we basically take any U.S. e-commerce site and replicate it and operate it in China. So apparel, cosmetics, food, household items, personal items. We can run the e-commerce store for you in China and fulfill all the orders, do the social media, and send you back U.S. dollars. So we work basically with U.S. brands and retailers and feed into the U.S. the China consumer market. Let me just offer a word or two of thoughts on what the coronavirus impact is in China. And I'd say there's at least two levels of analysis. There's a public health level and there's an economic commercial level. And for public health, for both of these, we're seeing a pattern not radically different than what we're seeing in the United States, but there certainly are differences. And one of the differences is China is probably 1 to 2 months ahead. I mean, it's the health impact and also the economic impact hit China first. So you had just a terrible wave of bad news in February in China. It was in the middle of Chinese New Year's, and the government extended Chinese New Year's down, but there were a real spike in incidents, real spike in casualties, spike in hospitalization, and the government responded sort of right at the end of January, beginning of February, with a kind of a national lockdown, a shutdown, quarantine, banning travel. Really, the epicenter was Hubei province, Wuhan, the city of Wuhan, so you couldn't go in or out of that province. So it took what at the time was viewed as pretty radical steps. I think now when we look at what's happening in Europe and America, it's actually sort of broadly adopted steps that if you want to stop this thing in its tracks, you really have to quarantine. So that did take place. It lasted several weeks. It's only been slowly relaxed. It's still largely in place with Wuhan, Wuhan's just allowed to travel again and do things again. And the situation of public health sense is very much stabilized, meaning not that there's no more incidents, but the number of new incidents is a flat line, more or less. There's not a growth or a spike. It's not trending the wrong way. So I think we can fairly say in China, as a public health matter, it is largely under control. But that leads us then to the economic dimension of this. And there was enormously economically disruptive in February when you shut down society, when you shut down transportation and movement, you're shutting down the economy. And there's particularly parts of the economy that are dependent on that. The travel and tourism industry, the hotels, the restaurants, really pay a price for it. But even the other operating parts of the economy, auto manufacturers and so forth, it's enormously disruptive. And that, to my mind, takes a while to come back. Some of it comes back more normally, and we're seeing in the retail space, for example, necessities come back very quickly. Food comes back very quickly. Even apparel and cosmetics, not really necessities in that sense of the word, but the demand has come back more quickly. But other items just come back more slowly. And what we're seeing, I think, now in China is not just the production shock and the supply chain disruption shock that can hurt the auto manufacturing sector, but we're seeing now the global impact in China, meaning if there's a global demand shock in Europe or the US for Chinese-made goods, then demand drops and China has to grapple with that change in the economy as well. So there's no question there's going to be an economic impact in China for this, and the market will be off for at least a quarter to, I would say, a snapback in the third quarter, but a bit of bad news in the second quarter. So that's just laying the table, Julian, and how what we see from our data, and maybe Craig has some insight as well.
How about yourself,
Okay.
Craig?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's great to see Ambassador Lavin again. I used to work for him, and we had a wonderful team in China. He's a very good Chinese speaker as well, so knows an awful lot about China. I'd like to do three things. Talk, because I'm in Washington, D.C., talk a little bit about the bilateral relationship, and particularly the Phase 1 agreement recently signed by President Trump. I'd like to give you one of our company's sit reps or situation reports from China, what they're seeing on the ground in their factories in China, which very much dovetails with what Frank just said. And then third, just some observations on what we're anticipating. So in terms of the bilateral trade agreement, let me just remind folks that it was signed in mid-January, but it only took effect on February 14th. And subsequent to February 14th, China and then now the United States has been very much enmeshed in the COVID-19 dialogue. So there has been, as a result of COVID-19, a lot of political turmoil and finger pointing, especially at lower levels of the administration. But I'm pleased to say that last Thursday, President Trump and President Xi got on the telephone, and things have become a little bit more stable and predictable. After that call, President Trump no longer uses the term China virus, and the Chinese are no longer claiming that the virus was planted by the US military. So I think that that's good. Also on the phone on Thursday, the two presidents discussed the agreement, and we understand that no exceptions were asked, no delays were asked. And both sides have reiterated that, that the agreement stands and will be implemented. And things are moving forward most clearly on the agricultural front. So quite a few shipments of American soy and wheat and corn and ethanol and other things. We should have an intellectual property rights plan promised by the Chinese later this week. And April 1 is an important date when the Chinese are supposed to open up the financial services industry. So we'll see by the end of this week as to how we're doing. Now, vis-a-vis the situation report from China, I was on the line with one of our major American manufacturers who has plants all over China and the US. And what we understand is that almost all of our manufacturers in China have resumed production, maybe not quite 100%, but they are headed there, as Frank had indicated. Even in some of the worst hit areas, such as Wuhan, factories have reopened. So one of our companies with a factory in Wuhan told us that the facility is up and running, but only a limited number of workers are allowed in at any one time. And each worker has to have their own bathroom. So that limits the numbers that could be there. Workers are not allowed to return home at night and instead need to stay in a special hotel so as not to bring the virus back or forth. So these constraints clearly limit production and capacity. But so while our company said that while supply chains are coming back online, it's limited in China. The rest of China is better than Wuhan. But what worries them the most is not China, which is brightening up and they're getting more and more data and more emails and whatnot from China, but rather the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, as China is brightening up, is beginning to go dark. in China, and so Chinese companies are not getting the orders that they need to get up and running, and so people are being fired from factory jobs in China because the export orders aren't there. There are many other problems in China. Transportation remains a problem. Highway controls are limiting drivers. Drivers need to be quarantined, so the truck needs to be quarantined. National highway transportation is a problem. So looking at February, I think as just to put a couple of numbers onto what Frank said, in February, auto manufacturing down 75%, express delivery down 35%, e-commerce down 20%, hotels, 150 of 225 hotels in Wuhan are closed, and the best occupancy is only 5%. So in the United States, I won't say much. I will say that our unemployment statistics are clearly very concerning, and that will have an impact on supply chains. Supply chains from China and elsewhere in Asia are definitely a problem. Do companies have the inputs that they need in America to maintain production? Clearly, lower demand around the world is having a large impact depending on what industry you're in. There is financial uncertainty, and at least on the East Coast here, a good number of bankruptcies, and we'll see how that plays out through the supply chains. And just the level of uncertainty is at an unprecedented level. And thus, my best guess is that we're in for a terrible April, but I would agree with Frank that in May we're going to see an upturn. We will get this under control once we have our testing down. And I would expect a return in May and hopefully a robust recovery in May, lasting through the rest of the year. But this is a nouveau virus. This is a new problem. We don't know the full, as much as we need to know about the virus, and thus there is a high degree of uncertainty, even if, as we look at what could be a dark April and hopefully a brighter May and June. So I'll stop there.
As we compare what's happened in China and what's happening here domestically, are we able to predict a May recovery that would either generate demand or enough stability for people to be thinking through their China strategies again to be able to adjust and get back to normal? Or is there a prospect of a prolonged winter?
Frank?
Yeah. Look, I think it's going to be sector specific. I'm pretty much in agreement with Craig that we're going to see good news gets in front of the bad news in May, that we turn the corner and people can properly feel optimistic about the general direction of the economy. But that is not the same as saying we've recovered or we're back to where we were. But at least the trend is positive. People are going back to work. But it is going to be sector specific, and give you a few examples. That travel and tourism industry is really going to be plagued for a long time. Sports, entertainment, event-driven, location-driven activity is going to, Disneyland and the Super Bowl and those sort of great activities are going to be really troubled. And then there's going to be industries that maybe were overextended or had other kind of burdens anyhow. And I can't tell you offhand what they are, but the point is not, it wasn't a sunny day before the coronavirus, and this just might be the extra 2% of bad news or 5% of bad news that really pushes them into bankruptcy or insolvency or really causes problems for them. But I think we'll see in May that the whole economy's on the mend. People are going back to work. I think Q2 numbers are going to be bad. They're going to be negative numbers in the U.S., but Q3 numbers will show that snapback. And So the real, as Craig said, we have a high degree of uncertainty. We don't know how deep the bad news will be, and we don't know how good the snapback will be. But these indicators lag a good 90 days or so. But I'd say for most American businesses and most people working in the economy, by the end of Q2, life will be back to normal, and we'll work through this problem, and we'll be functioning again. So I'm sort of guardedly bullish about the general direction of things.
So I would completely agree with Frank. I would say that there's a couple of indicators that we could watch for. One is in China, the government is being very bullish, but they have not brought children back to schools. And I think that that'll be a very important indicator. If kids go back to schools and they're able to withstand or manage any viral problems, then I think that they will have shown us a way. Another thing I worry about is peripheral economies. Japan just locked down for 2 weeks. And hopefully they have their situation under control. The Prime Minister Abe had been so insistent on having the Olympics that they might have underdone the infection control side over the last month. So let's see what happens to Japan. Because if Japan has a big problem and if Japan locks down, China will have a very large impact as so many input supplies, semiconductors, raw materials, and expertise come from Japan, and similarly Korea and Taiwan. So on a regional level, we're gonna, as an indicator, let's watch those other markets, which are all an essential part of the supply chain from China to the US. Let's remember, for most of our consumer electronics, they're made in 100 different countries and only assembled in China. And all 100 companies, all 100 countries are important if we're going to have a secure supply chain. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Craig. If I may just jump in on that, it's a very excellent insight. I would just add, remember that elements of this, such as the quarantine and travel restrictions, are lagging indicators. Meaning, if you were the mayor of a US city, or if you were the mayor of a Chinese city, and the health ministry says, we think it's okay, we think it's settled, would you end the quarantine that day? Or would you say, let's wait a week? Or why don't some other cities end their quarantine first? Why don't we just or if you were United Airlines and the Chinese health ministry said, we're okay now, or the US leadership said, we're okay now, would you say, well, I've got my flights gone now? I think you'd say, let me just wait a week. And then you'd say, let me start with 1 flight a week or 2 flights. So, I mean, the point is, these are all lagging phenomena. It could be 30, 60 days before you're sort of back in gear, back in stride, back performing again. And no surprise, people are going to behave in a tentative fashion in the early weeks of a recovery.
So let's turn for a second to the recovery business dynamics within China, right? So they've gone through a shock now. Businesses are, slowly coming back to where they ought to be, but some have not made it through. They've had to go through some layoffs. And then there's the second shock, which is a collapse in demand internationally. Which will have, effects on employment in China and consumer spending. What do we think about the effects domestically within China after all that's said and done, not even counting a potential third risk, which would be a reinfection of the population by other means?
Well, in my view, the Chinese central bank and Ministry of Finance have done a very good job at increasing liquidity within the economy. And thus, there is a lot of money out there. I'd also give the US Federal Reserve the highest A++ marks, as well as the Treasury, for really going at this very, very boldly. And the Chinese have plenty of firepower on the fiscal side. I would expect approximately a very large increase in Chinese debt. So currently, Chinese debt as a percentage of GDP is well over 300%. It's about the same as the United States. And I think in both countries, we're going to see a large increase in debt of about 15 to 20% of GDP. And that'll probably be common around the world. And that's the way that we're going to deal with this. I would agree with Frank, though, completely. It'll be sector specific. If you're in the food industry, you'll probably be fine. If you're in the travel or the luxury good industry, it's going to take a lot longer. If you're in manufacturing, you'll be in between. If you're in services, you might do very, very well in this era. So at least in my view, it's going to be very rocky and bumpy. But on the macroeconomic side, I think we're blessed by very good leadership in both countries that's going to be able to not keep a recession at bay, but to manage the damage such that it does not become overwhelming and such that we can recover in the second or in the third and the fourth quarter. And I think that that's what we need to be. We're going to need the patience to get there. And the next month is going to try all of our patience. Thank you.
Craig, to follow up a little bit on, what the business climate could be, not only in China, but in the rest of the world too. Now that China's gone over the worst part of it and is slowly starting to reactivate, parts of, internal movement. What do we think? I mean, what do you hear from either your members or from official contacts about the long tail of tamping down the virus? Is that a factor that folks are planning for? And if so, what are the smartest companies doing about that?
I think in China, the government is certain, is feeling more and more certain every day that they have been able to tamp it down, and they are feeling more and more certain that while there will be localized infections, that they will be able to tamp them down. So I think that the Chinese government, given its rather unusually high degree of surveillance and its experience, not only with COVID, but also with SARS before it, that they're quite confident that they can turn on the economic engines while maintaining sufficient control over the infections or over the populations, so that they're able to be the first one really out of the gate, the first country out of the gate with a full recovery. That's their aim anyway. And we'll see whether or not they're able to pull it off.
So a side question in all of the things that China's done to, prop up the economy, and, we've seen this since the financial crisis, they've done it a few times since. How directly into the economy in productive ways does Chinese assistance from official sources, how efficiently does it get down into, the consumer, and rather, so to the consumer rather than say real estate investment or fixed capital investment or any of the sort of traditionally normal priority areas of Chinese thinking in moments like these?
Well, about 90% of banking in China is controlled by state-owned enterprises, by state-owned banks. And they're not particularly efficient as bankers at all, but they are efficient at taking care of state-owned enterprises and larger manufacturers. And they're very good. They're like ATMs. They do what the government tells them to do, or the party. And in this case, the party and the government are so closely linked, they're difficult to differentiate. However, that doesn't cover everyone at all. That covers large enterprises, medium-sized enterprises, and larger small enterprises. But private enterprises that are outside of that official network are going to have more difficulty getting a hold of capital. Now, the Chinese Ministry of Finance and Central Bank has put together programs very similar to our programs to support SMEs and medium-sized companies. I think, I expect that there will be implementation problems both in China and the United States, to be honest. But I expect that those problems will be larger in China than in the United States, and that the bad loans are going to increase more quickly in China than in the United States. And that's a price that both governments are going to have to bear to get over this crisis and to recover. Now, Frank is a former banker, and he knows this stuff much better than I, but I think that that's where we are.
So,
What do you think, Frank?
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Craig. I'm not sure I know it better, but my views, I think, largely entail yours. And on the consumer side, I think there's also a fair amount of activity and social pressure, if you will, or systemic pressure to say what we don't want to see in the middle of bad weather. What we don't want to see are banks calling loans. We don't want to see banks being the bad guys. We don't, because we know it's going to be a hardship moment for people, and we know some people are overextended or don't manage their personal finances that well anyhow, so that most stressed 25% or 20% or whatever, we don't want those folks getting clobbered. So you're right, the banks are told this explicitly. I wouldn't say it's a paradox, but there's a little twist to this story in that there's a potential moral hazard that the government's sensitive to as well. What you don't want to do is publicly promulgate, for example, a regulation or a determination that says people don't have to pay their credit card. Because if you publicly promulgate that, then nobody's going to pay their credit card. So what you want to do, though, is say, look, we want everybody to pay their credit card bills or pay their bills, but if 20% of the country has a real hard time, we're not going to be fussy about policing that for the next 30, 60, 90 days. We understand it's a stress moment, so we're going to work with the segment that has trouble. So I think you'll find latitude, so to speak, in personal finance and consumer finance. In the same vein, the government's been explicit in telling companies, don't lay people off. Do not lay people off. You can trim salaries if you have to send people home, but we don't want mass firings and mass layoffs. We don't want this to ripple through the economy. So the government's very strong on that. So I think you'll find ways of cushioning the economic shock. We did get one real interesting question, Juliet, if I may turn to just the Q&A for myself.
Bill Edwards?
Yeah, Bill Edwards, very patiently, but I think we kind of touched on it, but he sort of said, can businesses reopen if consumers don't have, if consumers have spent 40 days outside the economy, can they start spending anyhow? And I think you're going to see a real differentiation in consumer behavior between discretionary goods and necessities. I mean, I think Craig cited a few minutes ago the drop in auto sales. I think you're going to see that bad news continue in the auto sectors. Like the real big ticket item, the discretionary items, consumers will push those back. But what we have seen is with food, apparel, cosmetics, a real snapback. People want their daily goods, and I've not necessarily thought of cosmetics as a necessity or even apparel as a necessity, but people want to feel good about themselves, and they have a plan to get a new something or other. They're going to get a new something or other. But boy, those big ticket items are being pushed back. And I think condo and real estate sales are going to be depressed, right? So I think you'll see a differentiation in the market between the everyday goods and the discretionary goods.
So something that Whitney Pierce just mentioned that I think is kind of interesting and leads to a bigger question too, which is, she says, it seems that payback leniency is a marketing tactic here. Do we see that happening in China? And I'd like to sort of expand that to what is the corporate face of the good company toward Chinese citizens right now?
I think that where we are in China is actually quite similar to the US. As Frank noted, banks have been told lend. So in Germany, all loans have been guaranteed by the government. Now, the Chinese haven't gone that far, but they don't need to because the banks are government owned. But foreign banks, for example, are not about to foreclose on companies in China. One salient factor here that is a little bit technical but very important is that China doesn't have a really good bankruptcy law or process. And so nobody wants to send companies into bankruptcies. And the banks, at least for until the crisis is over, are going to continue lending, even if it is a quote unquote zombie company that should be going out of business. And so at least on the Chinese side, the government, the party, the banks, and they're all very intimately interrelated, much more so than the US, are not going to risk social cohesion by closing down large manufacturers anywhere in China. It's not going to happen. A bad debt will be allowed to build up for the foreseeable future. On the consumer side, I think that Frank is right on target. You know, the government has to balance here moral hazard with increasing consumption and getting people more comfortable again. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's never going to be perfect. And it'll be interesting to watch Alipay and Tencent Pay and the consumer uptick in China. But I would expect that to happen over the next couple of weeks.
Another question that we're getting on Slack, and by the way, I've got a few other issues that I'd like to hit, but I'd like to season the whole thing here with some questions from Slack. We had a question from John. Have the Chinese ports and shipping lanes started recovering to increase supply outbound? Of course, we saw all kinds of shipping related news about the just messes in the ports, not only there, but you know, folks are really experiencing a lot of headaches here as well. Do we know much about what's going on the scene in ports and supply chains? You know, like you were mentioning with Japan and Korea and the rest, like what is the port and shipping lane and sort of channels of trade dynamic at the moment?
Frank, do you want to take that?
Yeah, look, from our business, we're business as usual. Now we've got a little bit of good news ladled over everything we're talking about, which is in addition to all of the dynamics we're talking about, a positive trend line in China and sustained consumer demand is sort of the bits of good news. On top of that, in our view, there is a secular trend toward e-commerce, independent of the shocks of this year. There's just the consumer increasingly prefers e-commerce as opposed to bricks and mortar shopping. Now, this might accelerate that trend, but whether this accelerates it or not, e-commerce is bubbling along. So we're actually at a point where we're air freighting goods in to keep up with demand. So consumer demand is strong in China, and the logistics system is working in China. No question there were considerable disruptions if you go back to February, but I don't see the problems in the Chinese ports being China-centric. I go back to Craig's earlier comment to say it's external demand. It's demand in the U.S. for iPhones. If that's dropping 20%, then that's the problem. It's not that they can sure make the iPhones in China now, but where's the global market for that kind of consumer electronics?
So Frank, you haven't been seeing concerns about safety either from supply companies or the folks buying things. I know that through certain kinds of crises, suspicion in China, because of the way that information works there, tends to go up, and folks just really get on their back foot about things.
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you. Our look. I have some insight because we're in that operating. But what we do is we run about 20 e-commerce stores that aren't our name, but are the branded stores for about 20 U.S. consumer brands, typically on the Alibaba system, Tmall, but also on JD and Pinduoduo and other platforms as well. So we have about 20 U.S. clients we'll run stores for. In February, comparing February to February 2019, 1 year prior, our business was off over 60%, close to 65% drop in February against February. But in March, which we're just wrapping up now, we will be close to about 95% of where we were a year ago. So we're going from about 35% of, so to speak, normal business to 95%. So basically more or less a complete recovery. Now, you could say, gosh, shouldn't you be up ahead of where you were? You go, fair enough. That's a very fair point. We should. But we'll say we'll take it as a victory just to be back where we were, to climb out of that hole in February and to say we're now sort of even. March on March, we're sort of even more or less for the month. April, we do think we'll be ahead. April against April. This is Craig's point earlier, that we're actually ahead of where we were 1 year ago, April.
That is, well, first of all, congrats. I think that's great.
Thanks. We're happy to be out of that hole.
So a question for both of you from Mimi Strobel, who's in Senator Ron Johnson's office. How much of an impact do you think suspending the 301 tariffs would have on both domestic and global economics? A quick explanation of 301.
Yeah,
Craig?
I'm happy to take that. The Trump administration put into place a set of tariffs called the 301 tariffs, which currently cover about $275 billion worth of US imports from China. And this was as a stimulus to stimulate negotiations, as a catalyst and it did that. The negotiations have had a phase one agreement, but currently up to 80% plus of the original tariffs are still in place on $275 billion worth of US products. Those tariffs are clearly a headwind for American manufacturers in particular. And so thus getting rid of the tariffs would help American manufacturing very significantly. We're in the very funny position of importing medical equipment from China, supplies, for which we're going to charge tariffs on, which are desperately needed. That medical equipment is desperately needed around the United States, and we have excessive tariffs on them. And that clearly is hurting Americans. So there's a big controversy, there's a big dialogue, a big debate in China. Get rid of the tariffs or maintain them until we have more openness of the Chinese economy for a phase two agreement. We would be of the opinion that the tariffs should go and that the tariffs are paid by the importer, and that those importers are American manufacturers that are suffering huge headwinds right now. And getting rid of the tariffs would be a tailwind, which would benefit the American economy. And I would say particularly in the manufacturing intensive states in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, et cetera. So it seems to us self-evident that at this time of economic peril, doing all that we can do to stimulate American manufacturing and protect American patients and healthcare workers is necessary. And getting rid of the tariffs would be helpful. So that is my opinion.
So we've got a lot of people at Get Global who've been affected by the tariffs. And it seems to be something that, like I remember that dinner that Frank and I did about a year ago, half the table at at this dinner raise their hand that they were affected by the tariffs in one way or another. So that's going to be a big deal. So I think the criminologists or the White Hillologists have been wondering, like, is this a negotiating tactic, these
Yeah,
tariffs, or is this orthodoxy?
Julian, may I just jump in on this topic too? This
But
is
to finish that question
yeah,
and frame it, if I
yeah,
may,
yeah.
uh, because that matters. If it's orthodoxy that they're accepting intellectually and emotionally, or if it's just a tactic, because if it's a tactic, then we could expect it to change. But if it's orthodoxy, we have no idea. Or challenge me on, what do you guys think? Sorry, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Look, I think I'm kind of lined up with Craig, is that tariffs in general are more useful as symbolism. The idea of tariffs can be potent and have some utility, but the reality of tariffs is nothing but a cost to the economy. So I think it's not bad to invoke tariffs as a rhetorical point or maybe even a threat, but be very careful about implementing tariffs, because you're just establishing a cost to everybody, the whole system, to businesses, to supply chain, to consumers, and it is a deadweight loss and a punishment to the U.S. economy. And you're hurting yourself as much as the other person. So be very careful about a trade policy that is all stick and no carrot. Meaning, if you're going to implement tariffs with somebody, then try to liberalize with someone else simultaneously. So at least you're getting a balance out of that, and you're not just imposing a cost on your own economy. So I'm largely in agreement, I would say, with the administration's diagnosis of China's malfeasance, if I may use that word, but China's problems and trade issues, that they weren't a good trade partner always. They didn't always lift up their agreements. They did deserve a change in tactics. So I'm sort of glad to see all of that, but I thought that we had the wrong solution, which was just imposing tariffs without anything else in the equation. So what I would say to anybody, if you're really concerned about inducing better behavior from China, the single best tool we might have in America is to improve trade relations with other countries. And that will help the US economy, and it will send the right signal to China as well. So I wouldn't take that tool out of the toolbox. I'd go back to TPP, and I'd go back to other kind of trade initiatives, the transatlantic trade initiative, anything that shows that we're willing to work better with others. We're not simply putting cost on the economy. There's another political dimension, these tariffs, that does concern me beyond the economic dimension. That is, I would tell anybody in leadership position in America or in China, be very careful about defining a relationship only on negative terms. Be very careful if all of your messaging and all of your policy initiative toward the other country is exclusively negative. And that cannot help but have a cumulative, corrosive effect. And look, we've got plenty of differences with China on all sorts of geopolitical issues, human rights. There's a million differences, a million problems. Be careful about adding into that extra weight, extra burdens, and be careful about your messaging being 100% negative, right? So I would not look for ways to step on toes. I would not look for ways to add friction into this process, but I'd look to try to send some kind of signal, which I guess is, sorry for being a little long-winded here, but that's a way of saying, boy, if we can unwind some of these tariffs, declare victory, maybe get some good signals or some good movements from the Chinese side, declare victory on our side, unwind some of these tariffs, we're improving the cost structure for U.S. businesses, U.S. economy, and we're putting a little bit of good news, a little bit of positive messaging into the relationship. So I would look for a way to go down that path.
Great.
Let me turn a little bit, well, let me say to the folks watching at home, if you have questions, now's the time to ask them. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I will go as fast as the questions come in. So if only a few questions come in, we'll hang out with those. But if we get a ton, I want to make sure that we get to those. We have one from James Robinson from Herbert Smith Freehills, the law firm and partner of Get Global. He says, it'd be logical for both the US and China to want to accelerate a phase 2 trade agreement to remove tariff headwinds and more urgently support economic recovery given COVID impact and November elections. Other than removing tariffs, will we see more substantive structural measures compared to phase 1, or more of the same largely targets setting ambitions? Craig, what do you think of that?
So I think that phase 1 was a success, but it was a success in gathering the low-hanging fruit. And all of the difficult issues are phase two issues. And it is very unrealistic to expect progress in phase two issues before the election, before the US election. It's just not going to happen. Both sides are distracted by COVID, and the phase two issues, which I would characterize as state-owned enterprises, technology policy, and subsidies, all go to the core of the Chinese Communist Party's relationship with the government and with the economy and with the people. And so it is very awkward for the party or Chinese government representatives to negotiate Chinese domestic subsidies with the US government. And so these are long-term issues that I think need to be looked at in a 3, 4, 5-year horizon. Also, unfortunately, I think that Frank was 100% right about building up trust and not bad-mouthing the other guy, and the costs that you pay if you do that. And both governments, I think, have been guilty of loose words. And that brings the level of trust down to a very low level, and it makes any type of phase two agreement nearly impossible. Just on Friday, there was a report in the Wall Street about the new sanctions on Huawei. Now, what's that going to do? Is that going to help to build up trust or no? So the relationship is very volatile, very difficult. We go from bad to bad to bad until there's a presidential telephone call writing the relationship, and then we start slipping down again. And this is a difficult environment in which to reach any phase two type of compromise. So I am not bullish over the shorter term on the phase two issues, unfortunately.
Yeah, let me just comment on that. I think Craig's right that phase two is the more complicated. It's in, it's the entire societal economic organization, and how are you going to realistically tackle that in short order? But boy, there are a few baby steps, to use that word, that China could take that would send the right signals and would help its own economy. For example, China could eliminate all tariffs on its own tariffs on pharmaceuticals and medicines. There's a WTO, what's called a 0 for 0, but a sector-specific initiative the United States and the Europeans have signed, and Japan signed, and so the United States doesn't impose tariffs on pharmaceuticals or medicines. China does. So again, that's not a concession to the U.S. That's not a concession to anybody. That's helping China's own economy, own society by joining that 0 to 0. It could do that. It could take that step. Another example of a modest step that I think would have enormous positive benefit for China. China should work out some kind of accord for Taiwan to join the WHO. Taiwan's not in the World Health Organization. It's in the WTO. It participates in a lot of international bodies. There ought to be some mechanism to allow it to participate even without sovereign status. And China would be viewed as the good guy if they were able to facilitate that. Right, so there's steps like that that China can take that I think help itself and send the right signal to the world community that it's looking for these kind of positive relationships. So I'm with Craig. I wouldn't say our hope should be on phase two and we're going to see good news in phase two this year. I don't think we will. But I would say to China, there's other areas where you could move the relationships ahead.
Interesting. I think that's something that we don't really hear much about, I think, but we should, because I think everyone's just been, conditioned to think about agreements and things like this. But we do have an innovation here from James. He's saying that we should have a phase 1B easy agreement. So any other sort of bits and pieces from phase one that weren't quite done yet, but also easy to say yes to, maybe slide those in. Do we think that there's any possibility for any kinds of like um, good news sheets of paper anytime soon, or
Well,
is it just the
example that
same?
would be very good to see would be an increase in the movie quota. Currently, only a small number of Hollywood films are allowed in. And that's kind of stupid and unfortunate. So those are the types of things that we've been encouraging the Chinese to consider as a good thing for everybody, as Frank said. But from a Chinese negotiator's position, they want to keep dry powder. They want to keep leverage. They want to keep they don't want to give in without the U.S. Giving some concessions as well. And so now would be a good time for mutual concessions. On our side, the easiest, simplest thing to do that I've been talking to everybody in the U.S. government about, just allow in duty-free things that are needed to fight the virus. Because we have a severe shortage, and it's just insane, in my view, to have a excise tax, an extra tax on anything needed for infection control. And that would be a very simple thing to do with the stroke of a pen, and I'm hopeful that that will be accomplished soon. But you know, the White House says, well, it's the Chinese paying the tariffs, it's not us. Well, that's not true. But unfortunately, we're caught up in that misconception here. It would be good to face this reality in a more straightforward manner. And
Well,
say,
one Republican staffer says preach. So I think you've got friends on the Hill who'd like to see that happen. Do we have any last questions that we'd like to hear answered from these two highly experienced gentlemen? Going once, going twice. I have one last question of my own in that case, and unless someone's just busy typing. So what do we think are the smartest companies right now handling this? Have there been any that you've been watching that are just like, wow, that's really clever? Specifically related to coronavirus response in the US-China context or the domestic China context. Like, who's just really coming up with good ideas, and what are they?
Frank?
Well, I think the global majors have seen more shocks and more turmoil, and from Brexit to the brush fires in Australia earlier this year. But the global majors, I think, are very seasoned, and I think in terms of their public statements and their corporate citizenship, companies like Starbucks and Nike have both done superb jobs in China and trying to say we want to do everything we can to protect our people. We want to be responsible when we close the Starbucks operation. We're doing so for public health reasons, but we want to get back open as soon as we're allowed to get open, and we want to treat everybody fairly. So they've done, I think, a really good job of putting their best foot forward and over communicating or having a heavy communication schedule. So I have a lot of respect for those top tier U.S. firms that are behaving
How have they
well.
communicated that?
Well, but the point is,
What style? Is there a,
well,
yeah,
but you
definitely.
social media is even bigger in China than it is in the U.S. But whenever there's bad news out there, and this is bad news, I mean, it's a public health issue, and then you have the economic dimension of more bad news, you have to sort of over communicate. You have to tell your story 2 or 3 times. What are you doing and why are you doing it, and what the trade-offs are in these decisions. And you don't, if you sometimes when we see bad news, we draw in and we're subdued, we don't communicate, but then the general public can infer the worst, and in a social media environment, that worst voice can carry the day. So if you say we have to close 700 shops because we're under a health order from the health ministry, you better communicate that, and you better communicate that frequently. But you say we're going to be back in business as soon as we can, and we're not going to dock anybody's salary, we're not going to fire anybody for these next few weeks. If it goes more than a few weeks, we have to take a look at that, but we'll keep people intact. So get your message out there, and the public, I think, responds and respects your statement, respects your position.
Craig, what do you think? Have you seen any really
Yeah.
innovative ways of dealing with
Well, you
this?
know, I think that the life sciences companies have done a magnificent job at trying to meet the demand and putting teams of people on this nouveau virus. And that's true of supplies companies, laboratory companies, and pharmaceutical companies, and they will succeed. Many of them through operations in China. Also, I have to give a shout out to FedEx, who's not only delivering Schwabs to the test centers, but also is really stepped up and is their flights to China and is really keeping commerce going. So a really great company in my view. And I would agree, a lot of companies have stepped up to try to help Wuhan to try and contain the virus to Wuhan. Clearly that bought us some time. I rue the fact that we did not use that time as well as we could have in the United States, and thus we're in the situation that we're in now. But many companies were very generous to Wuhan. We know of about $250 million of US donations to the Chinese. And now the Chinese are trying to reciprocate that to the rest of the world, highlighting the fact that we're all in this together and we all got to get it out of it together.
I think that that is a wonderful place to wind it down. Ambassador Allen, Ambassador Lavin, thank you both so much for doing this with us. I hope we can check back in again soon. I really, really appreciate the fact that you responded to this so quickly and that you wanted to do it. And these were great insights. I think that's all we got for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Julian. Thanks to the audience. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, keep up the good work, all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.